What about business plans? Should we be writing business plans as founders?
Google wrote a business plan. It was run by a fellow named Salar. And I saw it years later, and it was actually correct.
Hmm.
And I told Salar that this is probably the only business plan ever written for a corporation that was actually correct in hindsight. So what I prefer to do, and this is how I teach it at Stanford, is try to figure out what the world looks like in 5 years, and then try to figure out what you're going to do in 1 year, and then do it. Right. So if you can basically say, this is the direction, these are the things we're going to achieve within 1 year, and then run against that as hard goals, not simple goals, but hard goals, then you'll get there. And the general rule, at least in a consumer business, is if you can get an audience of 10 or 100 million people, you can make lots of money. Right. So if you
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. But the point that I wanted to bring out of this one in particular is that again, I think was really interesting in his point about business strategy is this whole idea. If you talk to people, if you have been involved with setting corporate strategies, things like that, you will see this a lot where a lot of strategies just completely fall apart. And you can even see some of the shock in what he says in there. And he was surprised that Google's strategy was there. And I thought this idea of thinking about things in terms of 5 years, but really focusing on the one is extremely valuable. But when he goes deeper into it, and I think this is the bigger thing, because oftentimes you'll see people look and they go, 5 years, we can't possibly think where we're going to be in 5 years. But actually, you can if you're looking at it through the right lens. And I think that's where a lot of strategy falls apart, is people are looking at it at this granular micro lens and trying to figure out, well, what are we going to be doing in 5 years? And it's like, well, of course you're not going to be able to assess what you're going to be doing in 5 years. But if you look at the macro trajectory of where we're going economically, from a business standpoint, things like that, then you actually can start to do that. And from there, you can start to deconstruct the kinds of things that you anticipate you may be doing. And you can get pretty good at anticipating where things were over the course of, for sure, a year with kind of a 5-year strat. And I say that from experience in that, let's just reflect back on my time at ChenMed. I was there for about 4 years. The strategy that I put in place when I joined, we actually executed on it, and it was right. It was exactly on par with what needed to happen. Now, if you were to look at, well, Christopher, the projects your teams were working on and the things you didn't have that in your strategy. And it's like, of course I didn't. It was an enterprise multi-year strat. I had to think about where the business was today. What are some of the macroeconomics of what's happening in healthcare? What are some of the dynamics of where technology is going? And granted, did some of those things pivot fairly significantly? Yeah, I didn't see Gen AI blowing up like it did in 2022, but I was watching what had happened with the pandemic and how people were shifting their attitudes towards work and where the world was going and how technology was evolving. So while I didn't know specifically, Gen AI is going to blow up in 2022 and that's going to radically change things, I didn't need to know that specific thing to be able to go, so these are going to be the big strategic initiatives and things we're going to focus on over the next 5 years. And then drilling into that within a year, it actually was relatively predictable. And so I love the fact he talked about that approach to strategy, because it is possible, and I've done it, and I've helped others do it. And so I think that is something that organizations can do a much better job of, because I don't always see them doing it that well. Or like I said, they'll look 5 years and then they try and predict what are the specific initiatives or projects we're going to have running. And it's like, well, those are going to constantly be moving, but the North Stars, the direction, those really do not change with the kind of, uncertainty that a lot of the other stuff does. So I thought that was a really good takeaway for folks who are trying to think about strategy. And you know what? Sometimes you need help. You need somebody who has that broader macro lens. And that's not a bad thing. I think sometimes we're afraid to ask for help and we think we have to know all the details. I think consultants sometimes get a bad rap because it's like, oh, consultants, this. It's like, well, what are you using them for? And how are you, because trying to keep up with all that stuff is impossible. I mean, that's why I think a lot of you, at least the people who've shared with me, That's why a lot of you follow my stuff, because you don't have the time or capacity to sit and pay attention to all the details. So you need somebody to go, here's what you should be paying attention to or what it means so that you can consider that. So I thought that was really interesting. Another one that I thought was interesting, I don't know, I had something to say and I didn't bring up this clip, but there's a part in there where he talks about understanding competition. And in it, he specifically says, pay no attention to the competition. Just focus on what you do, and who cares what your competition's doing. And there's a lot of, and I think if I were to sit down, and this is the thing with it, whenever I watch one of those DOAC episodes, I'm always like, I wish I was in the room, or I wish I had that same conversation, because there are things I would want to go deeper with. Because I actually think Eric and I would probably agree with this more. On the surface, if you respond to that, you would think he's saying, who cares what anybody else is doing? Follow your heart and just go. And that's not, I don't think at all, that's what he's saying. What he's getting at, and I see this a lot, especially when I work with tech companies, is everybody's trying to look at everybody else's like business strat and their competitive advantages and trying to do all this and then going like, how do we compete with that? And how do we compete with that? Instead of going, what did we set out to do? And are we being the absolute best at what we set out to do? And I'm not going to worry if somebody else is, doing a slightly different version of that, or they're going in a slightly different direction, because that will kill your strategy. It will kill your success if you go that way with it. But what I think he's not getting at, or the part that I would caution people, if you listen to this, you could miss, is it doesn't mean you don't need to understand your market or understand your customers' pain points. And I see that mistake made all the time, because people take this follow your heart approach, where it's like, well, I believe this is a problem, so I'm going to go for it. And I see this with tech startups, where I'll meet and talk with their product teams or their exec team members, and they're like, we have this great idea. And even our customers might say, yeah, but why won't they buy it? And I'm like, well, how much do you really know about their pain point? Or, just because they're giving you a nod or an industry report said this is a thing, do you actually understand the pain that they're experiencing? And if so, like, do you really know what that means? Because I don't think you do if you're having that kind of gap. So I think that was the only thing that I was a little like, I think I agree with Eric. And I think there's more to the story that he didn't necessarily come out in the interview.